Hi, I'm Carla Reyes. I'm an assistant professor of law at Michigan State University, where I also direct the Center for Law, Technology, and Innovation. I was a faculty fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University until a couple of months ago for a 2-year term, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a project that I worked on while there, and one that I think really just opens up a field of a call for action, really, for continued collaboration between all of our fields. So the general premise is this, right? The law, as we know it, typically lags behind technology in terms of its development. So much so that we have a name for the phenomena, namely law lag, right? But that doesn't mean that the law is not paying attention to what's happening in technology, or that we don't have general principles that we try to adhere to in terms of developing law related to technology. So namely, the law or lawyers and regulators prefer, where possible, to develop technology neutral law and regulations, right? Law that focuses on an activities-based approach to regulating emerging technology and it is not technology specific. In crypto land, though, we've had regulators sit back and watch, and what they've seen is financial loss, risk to consumers, fraud, right? Things that they're starting to get very, very concerned about. On the other hand, we also have state legislatures thinking, hey, let's actively bring business to our states, right? And so you have competing interest to that idea of technology neutral law that has resulted in very technology specific law, some of which Angela spoke about just a little bit ago, namely changing UITA, which is a technology neutral statute to, quote, accommodate smart contracts, right? Which is, they did the opposite of that, as Angela rightly pointed out. But that, and this phenomena is playing out in any number of areas in crypto land, in cryptoeconomic systems, and including the realm of governance of blockchain protocols. The law is watching, or people that make the law are watching, and increasingly are becoming concerned about perceived governance gaps and related liability and accountability gaps as they see it. So, I started asking a couple of research questions. The first is, what are the formal governance mechanisms that each protocol uses? And the second is, how can those formal governance mechanisms be formalized even further and made more transparent so that law people like me can recognize them and their striking variety, because they are numerous in types and kinds, and through a tech-neutral approach, so that if and when folks decide that they really feel compelled to layer law on top of those governance processes, that law will indeed be technology neutral and rather than technology specific. And I pause here because I think it's worth saying out loud that I do think it's coming. I don't know what form that layer of law on top of governance process looks like, but I wouldn't expect for the silence on regulator or legislature or even judge, right, judicial authorities, to mean that they're not watching and they're not planning. As you've seen just this last week, right, silence from a regulator doesn't mean enforcement's not happening in the background. So the point there is, I think that it may take a while, but that it will happen. And we are already indeed starting to see related lawsuits. So at the very least, you're seeing it in private actions in front of courts. So it was also worth noting that that first question I wanted to ask about what are the governance processes that protocols use, because of the striking variety among protocols, was much too big of a research question for me to tackle on my own. So I sort of set that aside for the moment and said, look, what I do know is there's a whole bunch of them, okay? And what I need is an approach that will recognize the endogenous priorities of communities and allow for them to continue to map their own governance protocols to fit their own needs, including the needs of whatever technology it is they're developing. And so, and that is in part, I should say, because as we've heard extensively today, there is no one model to rule all protocols, right? And I want for the law, very much for the law, to recognize that and to honor that, right? I don't want the law necessarily, because I don't think that it's our ambit to be like, oh, that's the protocol that should rule them all. Right? I don't think that's a particularly good idea for us lawyers to be doing. In any event, and I should mention that the result of that, those priors, I guess they might be, on my part, is a theme that shows up in my other body of scholarly work. I, at base, want to encourage governance by private ordering and contract. And that theme comes up sort of over and over, not just in this project, but in prior ones and in those to come. And so the solution that I proposed in the paper, titled Uncorporate Crypto Governance, is at base that protocol communities formally adopt governance contracts that can be recognized under existing contract law, right? And do not require any sort of new technology-specific rules, and offer participants a lot of flexibility in terms of designing the mechanisms that they want, but indeed do offer participants and users of protocols the transparency that everybody's really seeking. And that seems simple enough, right? You're thinking, okay, so contract, that's good. So what's with the title, Uncorporate Crypto Governance? Why are we talking about corporations anyway? Well, I generally spend a lot of time translating between law and tech, whether it's to translate law to technologists or to try and translate technology to lawyers or regulators, right? So I work with the Uniform Law Commission Technology Committee and spend quite a bit of time trying to explain blockchain technology and do research for them around other technologies, artificial intelligence, et cetera, whatever the topic may be for the day. And I spend a lot of time explaining to my colleagues, and it really is, at Michigan State, it really is a translation mechanism, right? What can I find that is something that they'll be familiar with, recognize, be able to commute sort of into their own framework. Now, the result is often a metaphor that isn't exactly right? And I recognize the limit of metaphors. Nevertheless, they can be a useful starting point. And so for this paper, the starting point is corporate governance. And arguing essentially that one way, not the only way, but one way that you could build a governance contract would be to model the governance off of corporate governance principles. Again, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the intent of the argument is not to say that it's the only thing that you could model governance on, just one of the things, but that it's a convenient thing because it's something that lawyers work with and recognize all the time, and recognize in general that corporations and uncorporations, namely LLCs, partnerships, business trusts, that they allow those participants in those organizations to craft their own governance via contract all the time, right? This isn't an unknown concept to us. What would a corporate governance model look like in this context? What is that translation function here? Well, to answer that question, I have to start with what is corporate governance in the first place. As Angela talked about in this space, cryptoeconomic systems, language isn't just a problem here, it's a problem in law too. And when you start to look at it, there's a variety of definitions of what corporate governance is. So helpful, I know. But when it boils down to it, you might think that you might be able to generalize into something like this. Corporate governance is a combination of internal governance and external governance mechanisms, where the internal governance mechanisms are pretty much internal control of the organization, usually rooted in contract. Which contracts? Well, the shareholder agreement for corporations, the operating agreement for LLCs, the partnership agreement for partnerships, and the trust agreement for a business trust. Why do I keep saying that? Business trust, because of the other papers. I'm a fan of the business trust model. But the other piece of corporate governance then is external governance, namely monitoring systems of regulatory agencies. So yes, law does come into play, professional institutes, industry associations, and non-governmental organizations. Their activities, the rules that they develop, the standards that they promulgate, all work to shape the drafting of and the execution of the contract that operates for the internal governance system, right? Together, the idea is to create appropriate accountability and responsibility mechanisms for corporations or uncorporations, as the case may be, noting that what is appropriate may vary depending on the type of entity, right? The state of the enterprise, or I should say the size of the enterprise, and the type of business undertaken, right? Some types of business are going to be more risky to consumers than other, and thus are subject to more consumer protection laws, for example. The players in corporate governance then, if this is the sort of broad general framework we're working with, for internal governance include directors, controlling shareholders, the shareholders themselves, to a limited extent, I should say, and externally, something that the literature refers to as gatekeepers. And again, here, the term gatekeepers might have more than one meaning, but the meaning that I tend to use in the paper, for the reasons described there, are namely reputational intermediaries, right? So folks who have a unique position with the entity, who have unique information, and then may act upon that information in order to protect their own reputation as much as the reputation of the entity itself. So if there is corporate fraud, the thought is, and the gatekeeper knows about it, the thought is the gatekeeper would act to stop or report such activity because their own reputation is connected to their so think attorneys, accountants, right, to their own connection to the corporation, such that if they don't report it, if they don't intervene, they will be harmed as much as anyone else, right? So think of gatekeepers as reputational intermediaries for these purposes in any event. If we translate that then to cryptoeconomic systems, we might say, and this first thing I'm about to say is quite controversial, I understand that, just bear with me for a second, that maybe fully validating node operators or miners, right, might be in lieu of directors because they decide ultimately adopt changes to the protocol, right? Controlling token holders in certain scenarios might be controlling shareholders because they have enough power to in one way or another, whether that's social power or otherwise, to influence significantly the governance of the community. External governance actors then might be foundations, founders, and the software developers, all of whom have reputational intermediary-like roles in the ecosystem. If the Ethereum protocol goes under, the reputation of the Ethereum Foundation will suffer, right? Clearly, as would the reputation of Vitalik Buterin, the founder, as would the reputation of the core developers, and it would harm their ability to obtain employment later, goes the theory. When you combine these things and you assign responsibility and accountability to these different actors in the system via contract, what you get is something that closely approximates finding an appropriate accountability and responsibility level that also respects endogenous priorities of the community. Why? Because the community gets to pick and write it into the contract, right? Nobody is given a role that they didn't volunteer for and agree to via contract. That's the thought here. And ultimately, then, you have a contract that law people like me and regulators recognize and may be able to point to as filling in the governance gap, if you will, that they're worried about in general. Now, is this a perfect metaphor? Absolutely not, right? It's not a perfect metaphor. That's the limit of metaphors. I recognize this. That's why I say it's not the only way you could go. Many communities might find this is an inappropriate metaphor for them altogether. But I would encourage them not to throw out the idea of a governance contract as a whole, right? Because that still stands. This was just one way for me to communicate to my law audience how it might work in something that's familiar to them, right? The goal essentially then with the project, with the paper, is to kick off creativity in thinking about how to develop legally recognizable liability limiting mechanisms that still preserve flexibility in creating and carrying out endogenous priorities for blockchain governance for any specific blockchain protocol community. I will say what this method of comparing it to corporate governance does for me personally as well, is since the original speaker this morning said, we should be transparent and clear about goals of research and writing in this space. The other thing this does for me is allows me to write additional papers later about how traditional corporate governance can learn from this space, right? And by making the links this way first, then I can inverse it and talk to lawyers more broadly about other issues, right? But again, for this space, it's just an example of what could be done. So in any event, I look forward to seeing this group build a field of study in which creativity about limited liability mechanisms for protocols, for other organizations that sit higher in the technology stack, what they might look like. Maybe it's not contract-based, but I can tell you contracts are something law people like me recognize and might be a good opportunity in terms of governance mechanisms that you can maintain control over, but still fill governance gaps that regulators are worried about. Thank you.